Hi, and welcome to Quilt Street. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras.
And I'm Rhonda Lother.
And today we're going to be talking about quilting your quilt. We're taking that quilt sandwich and using some sort of a stitch that goes through all three layers to create the quilting that you're going to be doing. We're going to start out with some machine quilting because I think that's probably the most popular option these days.
And that's my favorite option. You know, I may be partial because that's what I like to do at home. And there are all kinds of ways to machine quilt. You can work off embroidery cartridges, you can do free motion quilting, but those are really more advanced techniques. Right. And we will cover those at a later date. But for now, we want to show you some introductory machine quilting things that you can do on your own machine right now. One thing I want to point out is in order to quilt on your machine, you have to have a walking foot. And here's why. It's going to feed all layers through your machine evenly at an even pace. And so I'm going to show this little mechanism right here. A lot of machines will ask or require a walking foot. For the BERNINA, there's a little mechanism that slides down from the back and it simply snaps into place on your foot. And that automatically converts it into a walking foot, which I think is wonderful. And so I'm going to come to the front of the machine now. And I have attached an open toe foot. Previously, I was working with a patchwork foot. I have switched over to an open toe foot, and there's two reasons why I've done that. One, I have an opening here that allows me to shift the needle as I want to, and also, perhaps you can see this tiny little lip sticking out. It's a black lip sticking out from this foot. That can be a wonderful guide when you're quilting. So I'm going to start out by showing you really the first technique that I use in quilting, which is called stitching in the ditch. And to do that, I've attached the open toe foot and I've adjusted my needle position 2 spaces to the right. So let me bring my sandwich over. I have a little mini quilt here. I've got my backing, batting, and my quilt block, and I've adhered these together with some basting spray. All right, so quilting in the ditch means I'm right here in the ditch of these pieces. I'm quilting right there in the seam allowance, right where the pieces meet. And so, using this little lip as a guide, that's where I'm going to start. And also, I should note that I have slowed down my speed just a little bit. I don't want the machine to get away from me. I find more often than not, I need a slower speed when I'm machine quilting.
Right. Just to maintain that control, because it can really...
Absolutely. When you kind of go haywire, it kind of becomes hard to correct. So, okay, I'm just going to stitch a straight seam here. Again, look how beautifully that provides a guide for me.
So if you're working with a walking foot that doesn't have that little guide on it, and you're kind of more eyeballing it, that's where slowing down that speed, having that needle down position function in effect, so that you can stop and start if you need to readjust. Because quilting in the ditch means that you've got a slightly thicker layer on one side than on the other, and it can kind of, you know, it's like you're hitting a curb or something, it can feel like. So
exactly.
Again, take it as slowly as you need to, I think.
I totally agree. And look how beautifully that came together.
I can see it.
You cannot even see the quilting stitch because I have stitched right here in the ditch, right there in that seam allowance where the two patchwork pieces meet. I love it. It creates dimension without really showing the quilting stitch. Now that's one option. Another option you can do, I can still use this guide. I'm going to move my needle position further to the right. I was already at 2 spaces. Let's see how far I can go. I can go pretty far. All right. Looks like 7's the furthest. Let's try 6 and see what happens. Okay. So once again, I'm going to use this little lip as a guide. Whoops. I'll be positioned correctly. All right. Let's sew. Okay, now notice that because I moved my needle position to the right just a little bit, now my stitching shows, and that can create a really nice dimensional effect. You know, you can follow that line. You can make multiple lines across your block as many times as you want. You can stitch just off the seam, and I like that look as well. So just play with your machine. You can even try some decorative stitches using an open toe foot. You can try exploring those features on your machine if you have that option. But I really love to play with machine quilting, and I like the way it feels. And it's really a quick way to get your project done.
You can, even with a walking foot, you can get meandering lines.
Right.
By design, right?
Yes, by design.
You can do it on purpose. You're not going to get big swirls and swoops and lovely decorative things like that. But if you wanted to quilt sort of wavy lines, you can kind of slowly alter your quilt sandwich as it goes through the needle. That's another option. But for this quilt, for your beginning, just work on that straight stitch. Get it even, get used to the speed, get used to the feel. It's going to feel differently. You know, one thing that we should mention, I think, when you're quilting an entire quilt and not just a little sample like this, is it's heavy.
It is.
It's going to create a lot of weight. Even this lap quilt that we're working with here. You want to get as much of that bulk up and supported as possible. So either on the table next to you, throw it over your shoulder.
I've seen
I've
do
done that before, you know,
Yeah.
just to try to get it up off, because again, when you create drag on your needle, it's going to, you could break stitches. It can cause problems along those lines and mess things up. So just be aware. Don't be surprised by how easily that sailed through the machine. That's just a little 6.5-inch block.
True.
So it's a different ball game when you have a full quilt going on.
But a straight stitch is a great way to practice your machine quilting. You know, to me, you really can't go wrong with stitching in the ditch. It's just a great way to practice and get comfortable with your machine.
Or the stitching off the seam
Right,
line.
or the offset.
That's usually what I like to do. I like that dimensionality. So
Yeah, I like
it's
to
fun.
create a little secondary design.
It's really, and it's so satisfying.
It
It's
is.
just,
I love
it's
it.
amazing how little quilting it takes for it to really start to transform from this quilt sandwich of these 3 unique layers to becoming its own thing. It's kind of magical. I really encourage people to give quilting their own quilt a try, and don't feel like it's out of your reach, that it's something that you need to have specialty knowledge for. It's completely beginner accessible.
Absolutely.
The technique you just showed. Yeah. So I'm going to just talk briefly about hand quilting, which is not nearly as popular, ubiquitous, because, you know, let's be honest, it's very time intensive, and that's something that is at a premium for a lot of people in our current modern world, right?
Yes.
But it can be very meditative, and it can be immensely satisfying. The investment in materials is low in terms of how much it costs for the materials, the tools that you need for it. And once you kind of get the hang of it, you can start quilting, you know, more elaborate designs if you're willing to put the time in, really. So I'm just going to show some super, super basic things here. I have my own little quilt sandwich here, unbasted, but you would want to baste it. Another thing you would probably want for a full-size quilt of any size is a hoop of some sort. Not an embroidery hoop. Those tend to be a little too thin and flimsy to be able to accommodate the thickness of the layers, as well as the weight and the tension that goes into it. So a quilting hoop, a freestanding one. They also have hoops that are mounted on bases, and then you have 2 frames and what have you. But today we're just starting with this little sandwich. So what I have here, let's see if we can see that. I have 2 examples of different needles for different styles of quilting. Here we have a traditional between needle, and that's what you see here. These between needles. They are very short and they are very thin. Let's see if we can get the glare off of that. But what they do is they allow you a certain amount of control while you're working. You might bend them, you might have to go through this packet while you're working.
I certainly have.
I know I have. But they are designed for that traditional type of quilting. And then I also have here a larger chenille needle that I use for big stitch hand quilting, which has gained a lot of traction in the past 10 to 15 years. There are a variety of needles you can use for big stitch hand quilting. I have experimented and I find I like chenille needles. So, but there are packets out there with a variety of sizes and you can find what works best for you. So let's start with the traditional, really quick. Oh, I don't want to unthread my needle that I already threaded. I threaded this needle with hand quilting thread. Again, you don't have to use hand quilting thread. The advantage of hand quilting thread is that it is already coated with, it'll say here, it says glace or gloss or glacé without the accent on the end of it. Does it have an accent there? Yeah, it does, glacé. Means it's coated, which helps the thread glide through your layers more easily. You don't want to use hand quilting thread in your machine. No. It is only for hand stitching. It's also a little bit thicker than piecing thread, generally speaking.
Very sturdy.
So I'm going to use this blue because it shows up here against the pink nicely. And I'm going to start off by showing you quickly how to knot the end of your thread. You hold your needle, the eye of the needle between your index finger and thumb. You bring the end of the thread up and grasp it again between those two fingers, and you wind it around the needle 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Pull that down so that that twist is also between your thumb and forefinger, and then holding that twist, you pull it through, and you get your little quilter's knot. Isn't that fun? So with quilting, hand quilting, use a thimble. You're going to need a thimble. You start your stitch by starting, I don't know, an inch, half an inch away from where you want to start, and you just bring your needle through the top and batting layers. You don't want to go through the backing, and you bring it back up, and you pull it through, and then you want to pop it. Pop.
Perfect.
That worked really nicely on the first try. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it'll pull through.
I love how the knot is sandwiched in between, so you can't see it. You can't see the knot on the top or the bottom.
Right.
It's popped right there in the middle.
Yeah. So you want to do that, and you want to bring the needle up basically where you want to start your line of stitching. So I'm just going to start. You know, as they say, this is a minute to learn and a lifetime to master.
That's a good point.
This hand quilting stitch. I quilt toward myself. If I were more experienced, I could quilt in all directions, but I quilt toward myself. So I also don't take very tiny stitches. I am not an Amish hand quilter with 12 stitches to the inch. You don't have to be. What you want to focus on is taking even stitches. That's your goal right now, is even stitches, as small as you can get them. You don't want anything to be able to catch on them. But other than that, don't worry about length and keeping them real super tiny and pin pricky. That's something to work toward. So, okay, here I am, starting. I put my needle into the quilt sandwich perpendicular, and I'm holding it below with one of my fingers that's supporting the quilt sandwich below. I'm going to use my forefinger, even though I have not built up a quilter's callus. So it's a sharp little needle. Ow. So I can feel that, and what I'm doing is I am now, with my forefinger below, I'm helping angle the needle back up through the layers so it comes up on top. Now, if I were quilting on my own, I would be right on top of it with my face, you know, as close as I need it to be. And again, I want to get my needle as perpendicular as I can, as up and down as I can. Now, once this quilt sandwich is mounted into a hoop, you don't want it super taut. It's not like the head of a drum. You want it to have some play. And again, you work with that. You find the tension that works for you. So you may not be able to get it perpendicular when it's in a hoop, but do the best you can. And again, you just sort of rock it. This is called a rocking stitch. This is my best approximation of a rocking stitch up. And you want to load a couple of stitches onto the needle at a time. We'll call that good. And then you pull it through. Whoops. And you pull it through. Those stitches aren't small and they're not perfect. but you know what? They're great.
They are.
It really, there's such a charm about just hand quilting of all levels, I will say. I really like it a lot.
I do too. It's just, it gives to that old-timey feel. It's a lot, has a better tactile
It does.
feeling.
Hand quilted quilts do drape differently
They do.
and it might be because you're only using one thread rather than two.
That's a great point.
There's less thread that goes into it. So now I'm going to show what is a little bit more popular, not more popular, but has gotten more popular in recent years, which is big stitch hand quilting. Again, I said I like to use this chenille needle, and I also use pearl cotton thread. The first time I tried this, I used embroidery floss.
How'd that go?
Not great. Not great. I mean, it went. Let's put it that way. It was 6-strand floss, and I was separating it into 3 strands at a time, so it would have a certain amount of presence to it because the single strands were too thin. I didn't know that this existed at the time. This is great thread. This comes in different weights. This is a size 8, number 8 right here. You can see it on the label, maybe. And 5 I find a little bit too thick. So an 8 or a 12 are the sizes that I like to use. So again, let me just, well, I'm not even going to bother putting a knot into it this time. Same idea, but it doesn't have to be quite as much of a rocking stitch. It's a longer needle, so it's a little bit harder to control along those lines. But with big stitch, my stitches tend to be around an 1/8 to maybe even a 1/4 of an inch long. I like to see these stitches.
Absolutely. And sometimes I will use a contrasting thread just to create a secondary design. I don't always try to match my thread to my fabric necessarily.
I've seen some beautiful examples by well-known quilters who create almost whole cloth designs, but using varying colors of pearl cotton thread and just gorgeous, just so
really
inspiring, so beautiful. It's just another way to create this textile using very simple materials and simple technology. So that's really all there is to big stitch hand quilting. It's exactly what it sounds like. You're usually not going to be doing more elaborate motifs. You know, these are for larger lines, straight lines, Baptist fan, or your clamshell, you know, curved lines perhaps. I have done some more representational stuff with big stitch, but it doesn't work as you don't get the same picture that you would get if you were doing it with traditional hand quilting or free motion quilting. So that's that. Again,
I love that look.
I do too. I should go home and do some more of it. One quick thing I did want to talk about is if you need to mark your quilt. If for some reason you need to mark your lines, a water-soluble pen, and they're usually blue, is a great option. And I just want to demonstrate this. So you could draw a line if you just needed to follow a line. And these lines, I have found if you leave them for a long time, they will fade.
That's true.
with time. But if once you stitch over it, this is just a little dampened paper towel I have here. And I'm just going to blot it, and the mark goes away. So that's a really great beginner's tool as well, I find, for marking. There are a variety of markers out there, but I like a water-soluble pen.
I do too.
So those are the main methods of quilting: by machine, by hand, and of course there's always by check, as they say, which is sending it out to be long-armed.
Right, that's one of my favorite methods.
And that's a completely not justifiable, it's just a completely acceptable way of having your quilt finished these days. Many people do it, and it allows you to just then move on to your next piecing project, which a lot of people love to do. I would like to encourage beginners, though, to at least give quilting a try. Before you decide you don't like it, give it a try.
I agree. There's nothing like quilting your very first quilt.
Yes, absolutely. And then it's all from you. If you're giving it as a gift, you can say, this is from my heart, and I'm giving it to you because I love you. I don't want to get all mushy right now, but...
That's an excellent point.
Yes, that's the appeal I have for finishing my own quilts when I give them as gifts.
Yes.
However you choose to do your quilts is absolutely perfectly fine, and it'll be beautiful. So join us in the next video where we're going to talk about finishing that quilt with a great binding.